Hello, and welcome to all you wonderful people out there trying to make the world a better place. Welcome to the Dead Man Walking podcast. I am your host, Repeatedly Dead Fred, author of the soon to be released memoir, The Summer I Died 20 Times, which is actually what happened to me. Thus, the name Repeatedly Dead Fred. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with possibly the world's tallest intermittent faster, Graeme Currie, down from Australia, or up from Australia, or I guess depending on your perspective, who is the host of the wildly popular podcast, The Fasting Highway. And he also has a book of the same name. Graeme, happy to have you. It's been a while.
It has, Fred. Great to see you. And I'm really proud of you that you started this podcast and looking forward to your book coming out. And hello to all the listeners out there from down here in Australia.
Well, thank you so much. So why don't I just throw this to you? Because I remember when I heard you on Jen Stevens' podcast, and she gets mentioned a lot on my podcast. I don't know about on yours. Excuse me. I was very touched by a few of the things you've said, and you'll probably talk about them yourself. So I'm not going to, do the spoiler alert thing. So why don't you tell us how you started, and how you came to intermittent fasting?
Sure thing, Fred. Well, I guess up to about 14, I was a relatively normal sort of childhood. I was a fairly normal sort of a size. And then all of a sudden I had this big growth spurt and I sort of grew about nearly a foot in a year, actually. And when I was 14, my mum and dad, they purchased a convenience store in New Zealand, or what they call a dairy, like a corner store.
Mhm.
And I worked in that store for 3 years and I constantly was eating all the time. I just snacks, Coke, lollies, chips. It was just so plentiful. And I just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And as I got more obese as those years went on, my school life was really terrible. I was a subject of bullies' attention because back in the 70s, Fred, there wasn't really a lot of obese kids in schools. And so you were a target if you were. And so, I started getting a lot of attention from the bullies and I basically had to fight my way through school and it wasn't very pleasant. So I was really glad when I left there and my weight steadily increased. And one of the things that really sent me into a tailspin was a conversation I overheard between my mum and dad. And mum said, "Oh, Graham's getting really fat." And I was just shocked that these people that were my heroes were talking about me like that because I never heard anybody talk about, this is when I started getting that way. And so I went into a bit of a tailspin over that and I became more withdrawn and low self-esteem and self-loathing and all that. And my teen years weren't great. And so anyway, I left school and it was the best day of my life, actually. I remember it well. I was 15 years old, left high school. It was great because back then you could leave school when you were 15 and start work. And so I started work and the discrimination about my weight followed me into my first job as a butcher. I remember getting the job and being so thrilled, and a manager employed me and the owner came in and said, "What's that fat slob doing out the front of my shop?" And so that was it. And so I was kicked out of there. And and so I really felt the discrimination coming through. But, I was sort of rolled around between jobs in my sort of, mid-teens. And at 19, I got rheumatic fever, which is a really heavy disease for a young man to get. And it really knocked me about. I was in hospital for 6 weeks. I nearly died. I had the priest come and visit me, last rites. They told my mum and dad I wouldn't make it, all of that. And it was an awful, awful thing to have, really high fever. They were trying to get me in a bath of ice, get my sort of, the heat down to me and all that sort of thing. But I got through it. And what happened was I lost a lot of weight. And I remember after being in hospital for 6 weeks wearing hospital gowns, my mum brought my clothes over and they basically just fell straight off me. I don't know exactly how much weight I lost, but I lost a lot and I looked pretty good. 19 years old, and the doctors told me that my days of drinking and that sort of thing had to stop because I had a heart murmur. So I had to go on penicillin. So I wasn't allowed to drink alcohol. So you can imagine a 19-year-old young man. So I came out and I noticed straight away how differently people were treating me, that I wasn't obese anymore. And it was the first time that I realized how your image sort of changes people's perspective of you and how they think about you. And so then I got into the party scene, and I was always a designated driver, so I was pretty popular with people. I can always take them to the pub or party or whatever, and
Mhm.
and I was the only sober guy there, and the girls used to like that. So I had a lot of fun in my 20s. It was great. And then, after a while, the weight started coming back on, so poor health, that sort of thing. And I emigrated to Australia when I was about 23 from New Zealand. And I'd never heard of this thing called pizza, right? Because I was from a rural town in New Zealand where
Mhm.
we didn't have any pizza shops. There was no such thing. Anyway, I came to Perth in Western Australia, and all of a sudden I discovered these pizza shops and burger joints that you could drive in and get these burgers. We never had any of this sort of stuff in the rural setting where I was. So
Mhm.
I was like a kid in a lolly shop, and I took to it with all my heart. And I pretty much knew that I was addicted to all sorts of things, and sugar and fast food became a really regular thing in my life. And as it did, the weight increased, and I got heavier and heavier through my 20s. I got married in my 30s, early 30s. My wife at the time, she never worried about, how big I was. She just loved me, and we got married and all the rest of it, and had a couple of daughters. And yeah, and then sort of just through my 30s and 40s and 50s, I just became bigger and bigger. I developed things like closet eating. I would sit in my car and eat. I would go through drive-throughs at the fast food store 2, 3 times a day. I was hiding a lot of my closet eating from my family and my friends. Not many people knew. I used to eat a lot in my car. It was my sanctuary. I even got to the point, Fred, where I would never just pay by card every time I went through, because I paid by cash. Because if I paid by cash, then my family couldn't see the bank statements of every 5 minutes I was going through a McDonald's or a burger joint to pay for all this stuff.
Mhm.
And so I felt like I was really cheating them. And, I was lying about the food lying around the house. I used to hide things all over the place, in my office, in my car. My children used to refer to my car as the pizza, because there was just crumbs and bags of stuff all over the place under the seats. And I'd even have things like, stashes of potato chips under my seats, just in case I'd starved on the way to work or something like that. And so
Yeah.
this became a real habit of mine. And it wasn't until probably 2017, I met my now wife in 2014, my second wife, and we got married in 2017. And prior to that, I'd sort of said to her, look, I really want to get, into a bit of shape for this wedding, because, I wanted to look better. And so we started walking and doing all the usual stuff, diets, whatever. We all know they don't work. Short-term diets work, but long-term, they're not sustainable. We know that.
Mhm.
So I guess I came to the end of 2017, and I had this huge week, Fred, where I was at my in-laws in Sydney, Australia here, and my wife's family, and they're all great cooks, and I took full advantage. And I just ate myself silly for a whole week over Christmas, right?
Yeah.
Just a bender. I went on pub crawls with my sister-in-law. I was out of control. And I remember feeling like I was going to explode. And I was
Mhm.
flying home to Perth from Sydney, sitting on a plane. I'll always remember it, seat 44G, next to my wife. And I felt like I was just going to blow up. And I was taking up half her seat. And I just sat there thinking to myself, I need to stop this behavior. I need to stop. I love this woman. I want to be with her for the rest of my life. I cannot die on her. I am going to die if I don't do something about it. So between Perth and Sydney, it's about a 5-hour flight. And by the time I got off the other side, I was absolutely laser focused about what I wanted to do. And I told my wife, and she said, okay, I'll back you, I'll support you, as she always did. And she'd bought this book called A Life Less Sugar by a woman called Amanda J. Tiffin from New Zealand, who had lost all this weight by reducing sugar and that sort of thing. And I read this book, and all of a sudden started dawning on me about how much sugar was in food. I started educating myself. And then I just went cold turkey, basically. I just stopped eating a lot of food with sugar, sugary
Mhm.
drinks, sodas, Coke, that sort of thing. Once I learned that Coke had 10 teaspoons of sugar in every can, and I was drinking 6 to 10 cans a day, it's 100 teaspoons of sugar just in the drink. So I knew why I was obese, right? So I cut the sugar off at the knees. Then basically the fast food was wasn't as hard as the sugar was. The sugar was a lot harder. The fast food, I
Yeah.
just stopped going.
Well,
And
sugar is so addictive.
yeah, it is, man. And I basically, with the drive-through, I just didn't carry any cash, any cards on me, nothing, because all I was doing was going to work. So if I had fuel in my car, I didn't need money. And by starving myself for money, I couldn't feed a habit. I was like a drug addict that had no money, so he couldn't buy the
Mhm.
drugs. I couldn't buy the fast food. So that was the technique I thought I was going to use. And it sort of worked for me because I was able to break that habit of going in there all the time. And the sugar was a different story. That was a few weeks of withdrawal from hell. I mean, I was pretty ingrained as a sugar
Mhm.
addict. You asked me scale of 1 to 10, I would have been a 12, right? And so the sugar was a lot harder. I went through the classic withdrawals. It was almost like I was a drug addict. The voices in the head, the person on your shoulder telling you to go and eat that donuts, telling you to go and get that sugar, all the
Mhm.
rest of it. But I fought through it, worked my way through it, and I started feeling a lot better. And I discovered an Australian filmmaker called Damon Garneau, who made a documentary. I don't know if you've seen it, called That Sugar Film.
No,
And
I haven't.
so anyone with a sugar problem out there, you've got to see this, because this guy, he's a very fit, healthy man in this documentary, young guy, and he decided he was going to eat all this food with sugar in it for 6 or 12 months to see what it did to his
Oh, I
health.
have seen that. Yes.
Yeah, and he did all the tests and all that. And then what he was doing was he would eat the actual sugar. So if a can of Coke had 10 teaspoons, he would actually eat the 10 teaspoons. And it was a real horrific visual as a person. You just thought, wow, this is what's going into my body. I can't do this anymore. So it really drove me into getting some education about what was in food. So that sort of led me to the next step where I thought, well, okay, I'm sort of getting on top of this, but I need something that's sustainable to be able to get this weight off and
Mhm.
keep it off forever.
So, Graeme,
And
if I might ask, um, because you're already a large man, can you give people some perspective of how large you actually got?
yeah, sure, mate. So at my height, I'm 6'5" tall. I'm a big bone guy. I was up to about 360 pounds, something
Wow.
like that. That's my known high. I'm pretty well sure I was heavier than that, but I could never find a scale that could actually weigh me, because in the sort of that time frame before digital scales usually only went up to a certain weight unless you're at a
Mhm.
doctor's surgery. And here in Australia, our doctors don't tend to weigh us when we go into the surgery, or I wasn't in hospital and all that sort of stuff in my sort of 50s. So I didn't really know. And it wasn't until I actually found the scale and it really shocked me. So yeah, that's where I was weight wise. When I came to intermittent fasting, I was probably around that. So how I discovered intermittent fasting was around March 2018. I was lying in the hammock. Actually, it was a very hot day here. My wife was over in America working, and I was looking up, diets and weight loss and that sort of thing. And I stumbled on this thing called intermittent fasting, and I started reading about 1 meal a day lifestyle. And my initial thought was, what sort of loonies do that? You'd have to be crazy to do that. I mean, who does
Yeah.
that? Who eats once a day? I'm a guy that eats 30 times a day. How am I going to eat once a day? And then I started sort of thinking about it more. And I thought, well, and then I got onto Jen Stevens, and I found her popular Facebook groups, with the likes of yourself and Fred. I think you were a
Mhm.
moderator back then. And
Yeah.
so I started reading all the stories, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. These people are doing this, and the photos, and it just spun me out. And I thought, and then I read into it more, and I thought, okay, it's a simple process. You fast for a period of time, you eat in a period of time, you stop, you do the same thing the next day. So reading Jin's material and Delay Don't Deny and that sort of thing, and from the groups, I got the message about clean fasting straight away. So,
Mhm.
and my theory was that I didn't really know where to start. And I thought, well, okay, I'll get home at 5 o'clock from work. I'll just do that. I'll just fast through the day. And when I get home from work, I'll eat in an hour till I'm satisfied and full, not stuffed, get some good nutrients into me. And I'd already decided that I was going to eat a lot better food. So I'd
Mhm.
already overcome that. I didn't have those cravings for all this horrible food. So I started at 23 and 1, 7 days a week, and
That's
nothing
pretty
deviated.
aggressive.
Yeah, it was, mate, but I didn't know any better.
Mhm.
In hindsight now, when I talk to people or mentor them, I always say, look, just start slow, 14, 10, even 16, 8, wherever you're comfortable, and just, work it up in increments. But so I just decided to do that, and it just suited me because I got home at 5. I had an hour commute each way to work. So I'd jump out of the car and I'd have my meal and I'd stop. And so the weight was falling off me fairly rapidly. I lost 100 pounds in the first year, basically between sort of March and the end of the year. And then I sort of had a bit of a stall for a little bit, but I thought, well, I'll
Sure.
trust the process. And then I carried on until the next year, and I lost a further 30 pounds and just started moving again. But the weight loss was one thing, Fred, but the real thing that I found about intermittent fasting was what we call the non-scale victories and the
Mhm.
health benefits. And when I started seeing those things, I just thought, what is going on here? I mean, you probably heard me talk about psoriasis. I had a lot of psoriasis on my body,
Mhm.
backs of my hands, knees, elbows. Now, that started fading after about 3 months of starting IF. And then by the 6-month mark, it was completely gone from my body, absolutely vanished. There was no sign of it on me. And I'd seen 3 specialists about it over the years, some of the best specialists here in Australia. And they said, you will never get rid of that. You have psoriasis for life. It's just who you are. It's in your DNA. It's in your makeup. And I proposed
Yeah.
to them, well, maybe it's my diet. And they said, it's nothing to do with your diet. It's just your
Yeah.
DNA. Some people have it, some people don't.
They just don't
So,
get it.
no, they don't get it. And, it was that healing process of our cells regenerating, the skin. We see it all the time in intermittent fasters, how bright their skin looks like. I see it on my podcast
Mhm.
when I interview people like you're doing to me now. You look at them and you just go, wow, their skin is so amazing. And there was other things happening. Even my eyesight was a lot sharper than it normally was. I could see colors better. For years when I was obese, it was like a fog was over my eyes, and
Yeah.
I wasn't really seeing that crystal sharp, colors and that. And when I drive in long distances, I work in agricultural research, so I have to drive long distances here in Australia to go to various farms for events. And I remember when I was obese, I used to stop at every service station just because I was going to starve. So I'd have to go and get pies and all that sort of stuff, and just to
Yeah.
keep me going on the road. But I remember one time falling asleep at the wheel, and because I was so full of food, and I got so tired, and I just crashed, and I nearly crashed literally, and it really scared me. And so now, when I started intermittent fasting, that was another NSV, how I could drive long distances. I didn't have to go into roadhouses except for fuel. Um, I wasn't buying the snacks and the food, and, I had that energy where I just felt great, and I actually really enjoyed it. So there's
Mhm.
all these things happening, arthritic fingers. I couldn't open my hands. That got better after a few months. Yeah, so many things, Fred. And then I sort of thought, well, there's something in this intermittent fasting. And I did more research and looked into it more and more reading about the science and that sort of thing. And I was pretty convinced in what I was doing. And yeah, and that's how I got the 132 pounds off in about 15 months. And I've maintained that now for some 3.5 years in about a 4 to 6 pound range, which I'm pretty happy about.
Mhm. So just to clarify, roadhouses in North America are a little different than roadhouses in Australia. So roadhouses here are more like brothels.
Well, it certainly wasn't going to do any brothels, Fred. So a roadhouse
Yeah.
here is like what you would call a gas station or a service station.
Yeah. So um so the arthritis went away, which is what we hear fairly commonly. I know with my own, it wasn't, it was more body aches and inflammation than it was. And even though myself, I've stalled a little bit in my weight loss because of all my surgeries and COVID and stuff like that, how I know the IF is still working is because none of my body aches have come back. My sleep apnea hasn't come back. My gout hasn't come back. The skin tags haven't come back. So even if you can't see the the results on the scale, or the scale victories, the non-scale victories are just over the top and continuous.
Exactly right. It's not all about weight loss, intermittent fasting. It's so much more the health and rejuvenation of our bodies. And, we're giving our bodies a rest from digesting food all day and spiking our insulin. And so I always sort of like to think of it about giving our bodies a free spa every day, like a free internal car wash where we're getting all our organs scrubbed while we're fasting and we're getting our cells regenerated. And it's just doing us so great, for our health. And I think the benefits, aside from weight loss, are unmeasurable. I mean, the NSVs of, that I can think of and health benefits are just stacked up. So when anybody ever says to me, well, what's the benefits? I can rattle them all off and they just look at me and they go, oh yeah, that's because you lost the weight. And some of them probably are, but then there's the mental side of it, because as we know, intermittent fasting is probably 95% mental, right? Maybe more. And the application is pretty simple. You fast and you feast. So that's simple, but it's not always simple for the mind. So you have to get your head around and rewire the whole way you're going to eat, the whole way you've been taught all your life. You have to turn that on its head from going to eating multiple times a day to maybe only eating once a day or twice a day or whatever your protocol may be. So that's the tricky part, is the mental aspect of it. And then for me, it was, well, what do you do when you get to the point where you've lost all the weight? What happens then? Do you just put the weight back on, or what happens? But then you realize that you're probably going to be doing fasting for majority of, if not all of your life, the rest of your life. Because I know, Fred, that if I stopped fasting tomorrow and I went back to my old ways, it would take me 6 months to put on the weight. So I don't want to do that. And I'm happy with what I'm doing. And I'm a bit more relaxed now. I guess I'm more of an intuitive faster. I'm more in tune with my hunger signals. Whereas when I was losing the weight, I had a different mindset. I needed to get the weight off. And I used sort of roughly where I wanted to be, about 220. So I got down to there. And being 6'5", that was sort of, thin enough, if you like. And that's where I sort of stayed around the last 3.5 years. And yeah, but it's a real mindset game, fasting. A lot of people struggle, particularly if they do things like dirty fasting, putting cream in their coffee, having mints, drinking sodas. It just triples how hard it's going to be for them, because they think food's coming, it makes them hungry, and they white knuckle it. Whereas when you're a clean faster and you get used to nailing that clean fast, and that's probably the most important thing, nailing that first. If you can get through that, and then you can work on your eating window and your food choices, I think you're halfway there, Fred.
Yeah. So just for the people who don't know, clean fast was a principle introduced by Jen Stevens, where you're not allowed to put cream in your coffee. You're allowed black coffee, black tea, green tea, but with nothing added to it. Other proponents of intermittent fasting have these bizarre rules that say, you can have 50 calories of cream or butter or whatever, forgetting about the fact that that initiates an insulin response. And what we're doing by fasting is trying to get our body's basal insulin levels down. So we don't allow lemon in your tea or diet drinks or, Tic Tacs or anything like that. And it makes a huge difference for most people. There are the odd freaks of nature that it doesn't seem to affect as much, but, having been coaching through roughly 500,000 people in Jin's groups, we see for the large majority of people, the clean fast does make a huge difference to them.
Yeah, it does. And, fasting's been around since time began. It's not something that's just been invented by anybody. I mean, people have been fasting for religious reasons for thousands of years. So it's not something new. But the thing about fasting is that if you are going to do it, my theory is, Fred, you're either fasting or you're not. Simple as that. It's black and white to me. If you're going to do stuff like putting cream in your coffee and you're going to have, mints and all that sort of thing, you're interfering with that process of that fasting. You're interfering with the process of your cells regenerating. You're interfering with that process of the fat burning, all of that, and the mental aspect. You're going to make it a lot harder for yourself. And I've interviewed dozens of people on my podcast that started off by dirty fasting because they didn't know any different. And then when they made the switch, the differences have been night and day for them, and how much easier it was and how better the results were. Not only the weight loss, but also the things like non-scale victories, the mental side of it, getting adapted to it, all of that. But whatever you do out there, please don't dirty fast. I mean, I picked you up on what you said there about some people are in groups that they propose that you can have 50 mils of milk or cream in your coffee. But, that guy's talking about dealing with people in his clinic that are 400, 500 pounds, 600 pounds who are going to die. And what he says is that, I would rather see them put some cream in their coffee and use that as a crutch to get them through their fasting and not fast at all. But he also clarifies that by saying that he would prefer that people do clean fast to get the maximum benefits of it. But people will pick up on whatever they want to pick up. It's like the saying, you could eat whatever you want. We all hear that. And we know people pick up that and run with it and they come unstuck, because for 95% of us, Fred, eating whatever you want, Goddesses obese is what we did get to. I always say I eat what makes me feel my greatest, not what my mind wants.
Which is great. So you mentioned you have your podcast, which is called The Fasting Highway. How, and I've been told it's wildly popular. So Donna Doobie, I think, is involved with your Facebook group as well. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your Facebook group and what people can expect there?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Well, I guess that was an involvement. Once I got the weight off, and I sort of was so convinced about intermittent fasting, I just wanted to tell everybody about it. But it's not as simple as going down to a shopping center and seeing obese people. I'm going up to them and saying, hey, I used to be like you, I can help you. And I thought, well, what's the way I can actually help these people or people that were in the same position as me by telling my story? So
But
that's
haven't you
why I
actually
started.
wanted to do that? Like you're in an
Oh,
airport or you see somebody
hundreds.
struggling and you just like,
Yeah.
oh, I just wish it was appropriate for me to come up to you and change your life.
Yeah. Oh, look, it has. And I've said things like, I was in the same position as you once. It's okay. You've seen people get ridiculed or something, you'll go into their defense, or, you'll help them if you see them struggling. You'll just say, look, mate, it's okay. I was where you were. Don't worry about it. And I tend to say, look, I'll show you a couple of pictures of myself. And then I'll say, if you're interested, I had such a conversation. I was actually at the post office posting a copy of my book, and it's got a pretty dramatic before and after on the front cover of The Fasting Highway. And the guy said, is that you, mate, on that book? And I said, yeah, both of them are. And he said, I want to know how you did that. And he said, can you tell me? And so the conversation ensued about intermittent fasting. So quite often I'll just strike something up like that. But yeah, to answer your question, the podcast came about because I thought it was a good way to not only get my own story out, but get other people to share their stories. And I never thought in a million years it would do as well as it has. We just clicked over 1 million downloads in 59 countries around the world.
It's amazing.
And it has become, and 150 odd episodes. And every single one of them has been an inspirational story. And some people do OMAD, TMAD, ADF, extended fasting, all sorts of range of protocols. And these non-scale victories, I could probably write another book with 2,000 or 3,000 of them in it about what's happened with people with intermittent fasting. I've heard some I've never heard of, and some just blow my mind. They just keep coming, something new. But so the book that came along just after the podcast started. I published that in November 2020. You can get it on Amazon if you are interested in it. Basically, it's a summation of my story, my backstory. Then I go into about intermittent fasting, how I did it, and I talk about what intermittent fasting is, steps to work through when it's not going to plan, that sort of thing. So the book was more about if somebody picks that up and they can help change their life, I'll be greatly appreciate that. And at the time, I thought, if my auntie and uncle and a couple of my mates buy it off Amazon, that's a win. And I never thought in a million years, here we are 2 years later, it was a #1 bestseller. It's been on the bestseller list for 2 years now in the Kindle categories of weight loss. And thousands of copies around the world. And then all of a sudden, all these pictures started popping up of people with my book in all corners of the globe, like Kenya, America, New Zealand. And I thought, wow, what's going on here? And I guess it resonated with people because, we all know what it's like to be, people that have been obese or are obese. We all have similar struggles, the discrimination, the getting kicked off things like I got kicked off in a helicopter in the Grand Canyon once because I was too heavy. All
Hopefully
those
it
sorts
wasn't
of
in
things.
the air.
No, yeah, fortunately not. And a guy just said, "Look, we can't take you. You're too heavy." And there's all those sorts of things that happen to you. You can't go on amusement rides. You worry about going to a restaurant. Are you going to break that chair? You worry about going to the movies. Am I going to break the chair at the movies? So an obese person's life has a lot of worry, a lot of concern. I was very apprehensive about going out in public because I thought everyone was looking at me. I was paranoid because of my size. I mean, 6'5", 360. I was a big man and intimidating. So I'd walk around a corner and people would shake. And then when I lost all the weight, and I guess the easiest way to explain it, Fred, is it's like Spock beams you up into the Star Trek Enterprise as an obese person. And then he beams you back down onto the street and everything changes. No one's looking at you. No one's sniggering at you. No one's making jokes about you. You walk into a normal menswear store. You can find clothes on the rack to fit you in a normal store. You don't have to go to the plus size stores anymore, the big and talls, all of that. And the whole world changes. People started treating me differently, which is sad. It's a really sad indictment on our society, how I was getting treated differently. There was an occasion I went into a suit shop, an Armani suit shop in Sydney, and just having a look around when I was pretty obese. And the guy said to me, "Oh, there's nothing in here that's going to fit you." And he didn't even know I was in there. I could have been buying a suit for my son or somebody else, he didn't know that. And then now I go into shops, it's hello, how are you? And you get used to it, but I think it's sad.
It is. But, to your credit, you took the steps to get you to where you are now, and you're an inspiration to a ton of people. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I don't even think we have time to ask you the Dead Man Walking quiz questions right now. So if
You
people
can
want
ask me one, Fred.
Okay, pick a number
Pick your
between
favorite.
one. Okay. If you were going to recommend a book besides your own for somebody to take on a vacation trip, what would it be?
It would be a book called 14 and Second by a guy called Charlie Cifarelli. He's an intermittent faster, amazing guy. He's been a warden on death row. He's been a lifesaver, a dog that was shot in the face by the New York Police Department. He's an incredible, inspiring guy. He's been at the depths of drug addiction and all sorts of things in the days of Studio 54. He's been involved in mafia, all that sort of stuff. It's an amazing life's journey. He's an amazing man, and his story is incredible. So that would be the book I would read over the summer. I know it's not an intermittent fasting book. Just quickly, if you IF, of course, I would just say if you want a comprehensive book on IF, get Gin Stevens, Fast Feast Repeat. If you want the science, get the Obesity Code audio.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Graeme. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, go to Graeme's Facebook group, or check out his podcast. And this is Repeatedly Dead Fred for the Dead Man Walking podcast. Have yourself a great week. See you next episode.